Nobody likes to feel deceived. But the truth is, we live surrounded by a quiet lie. Social hypocrisy. It doesn't shout. It smiles. It posts about empathy, defends values, talks about justice. And when no one is watching, it does the opposite. Society has learned to reward appearances, virtue in public, self-interest in private. We demand morality from others, but we ask for exceptions for ourselves. And the most disturbing part isn't that hypocrites exist. It's that hypocrisy has become a system, a mask many people wear to fit in, to protect themselves, or to feel superior. We live in an era where virtue has become a show. On social media, it's common to see posts about compassion, speeches about justice, campaigns about empathy. But what happens when the curtain closes? A lot of people who defend doing good in public live the opposite of what they preach in private. In this game, morality becomes a status tool, and worse, a tool for manipulation. This isn't a new problem. More than 500 years ago, Machiavelli already exposed this performance with brutal coldness. In his most famous book, The Prince, he says something that hits hard. It's necessary to seem virtuous, but it's dangerous to actually be virtuous. For him, public morality isn't always about truth or authenticity. It's about political effectiveness. Machiavelli lived in a fragmented Italy, full of betrayal, power games, and foreign invasions. It was a time when the medieval ideals of the church were falling apart, and the rulers who survived were the ones who knew how to play the game. He noticed that leaders who tried to stay morally pure often got crushed by those who looked moral but acted with cunning and practicality. In other words, when the game is power, the appearance of virtue matters more than virtue itself. Hypocrisy, then, isn't an accident. It's a strategy. How many people today live by that same logic? How many leaders, influencers, or even everyday people build an ethical image but in private act purely out of self-interest? This split between what people show and who they really are points to something deeper. Morality as a social construction, not some natural truth inside us. That's where Jean-Jacques Rousseau comes in, one of the thinkers most aware of the contradictions of modern life. In his discourse on the origin and basis of inequality among men, he launches a harsh critique of civilized society. For Rousseau, human beings are born good, or at least neutral, but society is what corrupts them. He writes, "Man is born free, and everywhere he is in chains. And those chains aren't just political, they're moral. In society, we learn how to dress, how to smile, how to behave, not out of genuine goodness, but to be accepted. We create masks." Rousseau argues that public virtue is often just vanity dressed up as ethics. Civilization taught us how to look good so we can be admired, and in doing that, we end up feeding the ego, not the conscience. Rousseau lived in a France that was proud of progress, of literature, science, and enlightenment, but he saw what was hiding behind that polished surface: growing inequality, falseness, and alienation. The elite talked about virtue while stepping on the poor. Enlightenment salons debated morality while keeping servants in the shadows. That's the institutional hypocrisy he wanted to expose. Modern morality is often a performance, and if Rousseau mourned society's falseness, Junzi, a Chinese philosopher from the 3rd century BCE, goes even further. He says morality doesn't come from within us at all. It has to be enforced. Living in a violent and unstable time in ancient China, known as the Warring States period, Junzi saw chaos driven by selfish desires and uncontrolled ambition. Unlike Confucius or Mencius, who believed people were naturally good, or at least naturally able to become good through virtue, Junzi argued that human nature is, at its core, selfish and disordered. He writes, "Human nature is evil. Goodness is the result of conscious effort. In other words, we aren't born virtuous. We have to be shaped." For him, morality is an artificial discipline built to control our destructive impulses. That's why societies need rules, rituals, education, punishments, social mechanisms that impose a should-be on what we naturally want. In that sense, Junzi is one of the first thinkers to admit, without sugarcoating, that morality is social engineering, like a leash put on desire. And you can see this idea everywhere today. A lot of ethical behavior only appears when someone is watching. Generosity, for example, sometimes only happens when there's an audience. Good manners, kindness, proper behavior often disappear the moment no one is looking. So Junzi's lesson is harsh, but revealing. Public morality is often just social control over a private self driven by self-interest. When you put Machiavelli, Rousseau, and Junzi side by side, an unsettling picture forms. Machiavelli shows that virtue can be useful as a disguise. Rousseau shows that society turns virtue into theatre. Junzi says that without that theatre, civilization might not even exist, because we'd be animals led by instinct. So what does that say about us today? We live in a world of constant exposure. Social media created permanent stages where anyone can perform virtue. We post inspirational quotes, donate to causes, support minorities. But many times that exists alongside private behavior that shows contempt, selfishness, or total indifference. Have you ever seen someone passionately defend respect in public, but attack anyone who disagrees in private? Or someone preach compassion while treating people below them like garbage? The philosophical lesson here is uncomfortable. Social hypocrisy isn't just a random flaw, it's structural, because we live in a system that values the appearance of goodness more than the hard work of real self-change. The result is a world where selfishness learns to speak the language of virtue and hides behind it, where noble speeches justify privilege, where morality is used less to build character and more to build an image. But is there a way out? Maybe the first step is admitting that real consistency is rare, and it takes courage. The courage to be ethical, even when nobody sees, to do good without needing applause, to admit we do have selfish desires, and that only through conscious effort can we rise above them. As Junzi himself said, only through self-cultivation do we become noble. The noble person isn't born ready, they are shaped. And for that to happen, we have to stop confusing virtue with vanity. Not every beautiful gesture is sincere. Not every moral-sounding word is truly committed to the good. How many times is what we call good actually a disguised form of domination? We're surrounded by moral talk. What's right? What's wrong? What should be done? What should be avoided? But who decides that? And more importantly, who benefits when everyone obeys? Behind the good label, there's often a desire for power, control, and submission. That's a hard philosophical truth, and maybe that's exactly why people avoid it. But three thinkers, separated by centuries and different cultures, had the courage to say it clearly. Morality can be a weapon. Let's start with Friedrich Nietzsche. On the Genealogy of Morality, he attacks the roots of what we call Western morality. Nietzsche didn't believe moral values like humility, compassion, or obedience were universal or natural. Quite the opposite. He argued that many of these values were born from the resentment of the weak against the strong. According to him, in ancient times, the noble classes defined good as whatever expressed vitality, strength, courage, and straightforward honesty. But the weak, who couldn't defeat the strong physically or politically, created another kind of morality. They called the strong evil and said the weak were good because they endured pain, obeyed, and submitted. Nietzsche writes, "Resentment in the powerless creates values. This herd morality, as he calls it, flips life's original values upside down. Now, the good person isn't the noble one, but the sufferer, the obedient one, the guilty one. Virtue becomes a form of collective self-deception. It's easier to call something a sin than to admit we simply can't reach it. And worse, this morality doesn't just comfort the weak, it serves the system. Because a population that feels guilty, resigned, and afraid is easier to control." Nietzsche lived in a world where Christian morality still dominated Europe. But his criticism goes beyond Christianity. He's pointing at any system that turns suffering into virtue, obedience into the highest value, and the desire to live intensely into guilt. That critique goes even deeper with Michel Foucault, a 20th century French philosopher who studied how modern society controls bodies, not just ideas. In Discipline and Punish, Foucault shows that modern institutions, schools, hospitals, military barracks, factories and prisons work like discipline machines. The open, brutal punishment of medieval times was replaced by something far more efficient: invisible control, disguised as civilized life. He says, power is most effective when it is least visible. Rules became the new whip. Instead of public punishment, we get evaluations. Instead of chains, we get schedules, records, reports, cameras, tests. Control is no longer something forced from the outside. It becomes a code we absorb. From an early age, we learn to watch ourselves, adjust ourselves, and fit in. What's most disturbing in Foucault is his point that good norms, like being punctual, productive, healthy, calm, are used to shape the ideal person for a disciplined society. Modern morality doesn't set you free, it tames you. It's as if each person carries an invisible guard inside them, and in that context, even goodness becomes a form of oppression, because it defines what's acceptable and pushes out what's different. Being normal becomes more important than being fair. Being appropriate matters more than being authentic. But this kind of moral control isn't exclusive to the West. In ancient China, a thinker named Han Feizi, 3rd century BCE, reached equally provocative conclusions, through a different path. Han Feizi was one of the main voices of legalism, a school of thought with a realistic, almost cynical view of human nature. People are not naturally good. They're driven by self-interest. So a stable state shouldn't depend on people's virtue, because virtue is rare, unstable, and easily corrupted. He writes, relying on virtue to govern is like depending on luck. For Han Feizi, what keeps order isn't moral principles, but clear laws and strict punishments. Rules must be objective and enforced consistently, even if it looks harsh. He believed the hypocrisy of appearing virtuous could be useful as long as the system worked. In a world where people's emotions and desires are unstable, Han Feizi argued that a ruler shouldn't trust the people's goodness, but should trust systems of control. Virtue here is a facade. Stability is what matters. His ideas grew in a brutal period of Chinese history, marked by constant war. The unification of China under the Qin dynasty used legalist principles and created an efficient but extremely rigid regime. What unites Nietzsche, Foucault, and Han Feizi is this radical distrust. The language of good can be manipulated. Morality can be built not to free people, but to produce obedience. And the more goodness is praised in public, the harder it becomes to challenge it. So the question becomes unavoidable. Is what you call right actually ethical? Or is it just what you were trained to accept through fear, convenience, or repetition? How many times have you held yourself back just to avoid looking inappropriate? How many times have you swallowed your opinion because it didn't fit what was politically correct? How many times have you felt guilt, not because you did something wrong, but simply because you wanted to live outside the standard script? These thinkers push us into an uncomfortable but necessary place: self-criticism. They show that real ethics can't come from blindly repeating norms or passively obeying ready-made ideals. True ethical freedom requires clarity. It requires the courage to see where goodness is being used as a mask for control. And it requires strength to break away from a morality that exists mainly to protect the status quo. As Nietzsche said, morality is the great lie the weak tell themselves to endure their own weakness. As Foucault taught, where there is power, there is resistance. And as Han Feizi warned, don't confuse a good appearance with good governance. In the end, the lesson is clear and painful. Not every speech about kindness truly wants what's best for you. Not every moral rule sets you free. Not every praise of virtue is sincere. Some chains are golden, others are invisible, but they all bind you when you don't question what you're really calling good. Not every kind of help is generous. Not every act of charity is virtue. Sometimes the hand that gives is the same hand that keeps someone on their knees. We live in a world where solidarity is celebrated in public. Millionaires make donations that go viral. Companies pose as humanitarian in emotional commercials. Influencers film themselves handing out food baskets, clothes, and smiles. But deep down, who is truly being helped and who is being displayed? This is the philosophical wound few people want to touch. Charity can humiliate when it serves the giver's ego more than the receiver's dignity. It becomes a theatre of goodness where applause matters more than real change. This theatre was already exposed by Karl Marx in the 19th century. In Capital, his criticism goes far beyond economics. He saw social relationships as a system of exploitation held up by moral appearances. To Marx, bourgeois charity, the kind that throws crumbs to the poor, is basically ideological anesthesia. He argues that charity can hide structural injustice by offering relief without changing what causes the suffering. Marx saw this clearly in industrial England. While factory owners exploited children for 14-hour workdays, they donated a few coins to the church or public charity and walked away praised as philanthropists. It was a way to calm their conscience without touching the system that created the misery. That's the cruel logic. Exploit on one side, make up for it on the other. But someone who is starving doesn't need handouts. They need justice. And justice, Marx reminds us, isn't built through symbolic gestures, but through structural change. Today, the same mechanism is still alive. Companies that pay miserable wages run social campaigns to clean up their image. Celebrities living in luxury donate a portion of the profit from overpriced products and get headlines. In cases like that, charity doesn't fix inequality. It preserves it as long as it stays manageable. This critique becomes even more personal with Simone Weil, a 20th century French philosopher and mystic. Weil didn't talk about charity only as a system, but as an inner experience, often filled with vanity. In Gravity and Grace, she questions what happens when helping others turns into a subtle form of superiority. She writes that helping should not be a way to prove yourself, but a way to step back in front of someone else's pain. Simone Weil lived with extreme intensity. She left a comfortable life, worked in factories to feel the suffering of workers, and rejected privileges to live closer to the poor. She understood that real compassion doesn't want to be seen, because when we help expecting recognition, applause, or even gratitude, we're not serving the other person. We're feeding our own ego. In that case, charity turns into spiritual vanity. The giver feels morally elevated, almost saint-like, but the person receiving it often feels the weight of debt, inferiority, and the humiliation of depending on someone else's goodwill. That's why Weil insists, true help requires silence, discretion, and humility. It requires seeing the other person not as below, but as equal in dignity. Real virtue is pure attention, not a performance. Long before her, this same idea was defended by Confucius, one of the pillars of classical Chinese thought. In the Analects, a collection of teachings recorded by his students, Confucius speaks of benevolence, Ren, as the heart of ethical life. But that benevolence isn't about big public gestures. It's built through daily practice, care in small things, and quiet respect. He teaches that benevolence isn't in pretty words, but in consistent, discreet actions. Confucius lived in a China marked by war and moral decay. His mission was to restore order and humanity, but he knew ethics can't be forced. It has to be practiced. For him, anyone who shows off their virtue has already lost it. And anyone who brags about helping is humiliating the other person without even realizing it. In the Confucian view, real charity is invisible. It begins in how we speak, how we listen, how we treat the most vulnerable, without expecting a reward. It's inner work that shows itself in the world, not a public act meant to win respect. Today, That wisdom sounds almost revolutionary, because we live in a culture where help has to be recorded, shared, and monetized. If it doesn't get likes, it feels like it never happened. But think about it. How many times does help come with an unspoken demand for gratitude? How many times is the person receiving help exposed as an inspiring story, just to make the benefactor look good? Charity, when it isn't done with awareness, can lower people, humiliate them, trap them. It can turn those in need into objects and turn the helper into a manufactured hero. The lesson from these three thinkers, so far apart in time and culture, meets in one central point. Real help sets people free. Fake charity keeps people trapped. Marx warns us about charity that keeps an unjust system running. Well, exposes charity that feeds spiritual pride. Confucius teaches that true charity doesn't need to be seen, it needs to be lived. And you? Have you ever stopped to ask yourself why you help? Is it compassion, guilt, status, fear of looking insensitive? That's a hard question, but a necessary one. Because only when help comes from a sincere, quiet, humble place can it truly heal. Otherwise, charity can become just another sophisticated way to keep people exactly where the system wants them. Dependent, grateful, submissive. And that, far from being virtue, is a new kind of violence. A polished violence, filmed in HD with an inspirational soundtrack. But violence all the same. If you work hard, you'll make it. How many times have you heard that said like it's an absolute truth? It's in schools, political speeches, social media, and self-help books. But is it really that simple? Are effort and merit actually enough to win? Meritocracy is a tempting promise. You reap what you sow. If you're at the top, you deserve it. If you're at the bottom, you just didn't try hard enough. But that idea, so fair on the surface, hides a dangerous lie. It turns inequality into personal guilt, and it turns privilege into merit. Let's start with Pierre Bourdieu, a 20th century French sociologist who resobled the meritocracy illusion with surgical precision in distinction. For him, what we call merit is often just an invisible inheritance, an inheritance of culture, language, habits, and even taste. Bourdieu developed the idea of cultural capital. People aren't born only with material wealth, but with symbolic resources like vocabulary, the way they speak, the references they know, the way they dress and act. You learn these things from childhood, almost without noticing. And they're the things that open doors, at job interviews, in schools, in social circles. He wrote, "School demands from students what the family has already given them." In other words, if you grew up in a cultured environment, with books at home, parents who encourage critical thinking, people who speak well and understand the social game, you start ahead. And if you grew up without any of that, you often have to fight 3 times harder just to maybe reach the same place. But here's the trick. When someone with cultural and social advantages succeeds, they say it was merit, mai. And when someone fails or can't climb, they get labeled lazy, untalented, or incompetent. So meritocracy becomes a system that makes inequality look natural. The most disturbing part is how it hides where the advantage actually came from. Few people want to admit that a huge part of success comes from your starting point, not just your effort during the race. And meritocracy protects that starting point while blaming everyone who got left behind. This critique gets strong support from John Rawls, a 20th century American philosopher and author of A Theory of Justice. Rawls wasn't a radical critic of liberal society, but he believed real justice requires making up for inequality at the starting line. In his famous thought experiment, Rawls asks us to imagine designing society before we're born, without knowing if we'll be rich or poor, healthy or sick, talented or limited. He calls this the original position. From that neutral perspective, he asks, what rules of justice would you choose? The answer is clear. You would accept inequalities only if they benefited the poorest, and you would recognize that a person's talents, abilities, and opportunities in life are largely the result of luck, not merit. Rawls writes, "No one deserves greater natural ability or a more favorable social position at birth. So, if someone is born with high intelligence, beauty, talent, or into a wealthy family, that's luck, not an achievement. And if a society wants to be fair, it must balance those advantages with policies that help people who started with less." Rawls's central idea is the difference principle. Inequalities are only acceptable if they help improve the lives of those who have the least. But what we often see in real life is the opposite. Inequality is justified with personal effort, even when the starting line was completely unfair. People born into privilege rarely see it as an advantage, and people born into hardship are treated like they're guilty for their suffering. Rawls forces us to rethink what merit even means. He doesn't deny that effort matters, but he says effort can only be judged fairly when the starting conditions are comparable. Otherwise, it's like giving a trophy to a runner who started miles ahead. This awareness of basic inequality also appears in Mencius, Mengzi, one of the most important thinkers in the Confucian tradition, who lived in China in the 4th century BCE. For him, a just ruler is someone who takes care of the people before demanding anything from them. Mencius wrote, "Those who work with their minds should govern. Those who work with their hands should be supported." But this isn't a defense of exploitation, it's the opposite. Mencius believed the government had a moral duty to guarantee the people basic conditions for life: food, housing, dignity. Only after that would it be fair to talk about duties, effort, and merit. He strongly criticized rulers who demanded obedience and productivity while the people were starving. For him, virtue only grows where there is dignity, and a population crushed by misery can't be judged by the same standard as a population protected by good conditions. It's a philosophy that puts compassion before pressure, and it teaches a simple lesson. It's not fair to demand merit where there is abandonment. That lesson hits hard in today's world. How often do we judge children by their school performance without considering their home environment? How often are workers called unproductive, even while dealing with exhausting schedules, terrible transportation, and low pay? How often is poverty treated like a character flaw instead of a system failure? Meritocracy, sold as a path upward, often works like an invisible barrier that keeps positions frozen in place. It turns privilege into achievement, and it turns failure into personal blame. But there is a way out. It starts with realizing that no merit is pure. Every talent needs opportunity. Every effort needs support. Every achievement depends on factors that go far beyond personal willpower. Real justice requires that we stop comparing lives as if everyone started from the same place. And it requires that dignity be a right for everyone, not a reward for a few. Mencius reminds us that a just ruler cares before demanding. Rawls teaches that luck shouldn't be treated as something people deserve. And Bourdieu shows us that merit is often just the privileged inheritance, disguised as talent. The philosophical challenge is hard, but necessary. Rethinking merit isn't about insulting effort, it's about freeing it from a lie. So that one day, we can say merit exists, without that meaning stepping on people who never even had a chance. We keep saying, "I'm free," but are we, really? What if the freedom we defend so much is just a well-built illusion? Maybe the scariest thing isn't living without freedom. It's believing we're free while wearing an invisible leash. When you look at freedom through philosophy, it's not simple. It can mean choice, independence, spontaneity. But it can also be manipulated, shaped, and controlled under the disguise of the common good. One of the first thinkers to explore this paradox in a radical way was Thomas Hobbes, a 17th century English philosopher, in his book, Leviathan. Hobbes lived through the chaos of civil wars and political instability in England. He saw kings die, order collapse, and violence take over the streets. That experience led him to an uncomfortable conclusion. Human beings by nature can be dangerous. If left loose, guided only by desire and self-interest, people become a threat to others and to themselves. Hobbes wrote, Man is a wolf to man. That line sums up his dark view of human nature. For him, in the natural state, without laws, there is no real freedom, only fear. It's a war of all against all, where life, as he put it, is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. So the escape is the social contract. People give up total freedom in exchange for safety and order. They accept being ruled by a central power, the Leviathan, which, even if authoritarian, guarantees peace. And here's the most uncomfortable part. Hobbes says that once we accept that control, we start calling it freedom. Not because we're free to do everything, but because we're no longer living in constant fear of violent death. In other words, freedom in real life becomes rational submission. We give up autonomy out of fear. We accept limits, laws, surveillance, punishment, and we call that civilization. How often do we do the same thing today? When we accept being tracked in the name of security, when we give up privacy in the name of convenience, when we obey without questioning because we're afraid of looking out of place. That's freedom on a leash. Yes, you can run, but only as far as the rope allows. But if Hobbes saw freedom as the price we pay for control, John Stuart Mill, a 19th century British philosopher, saw a new enemy of freedom growing stronger: society itself. In On Liberty, Mill warns about a kind of oppression that doesn't come from the state, or laws, or violence, but from something that seems harmless: public opinion. He called it the tyranny of the majority. In other words, even in democracies, where everyone votes and decides together, the majority can force its values, tastes, beliefs, and behaviors onto everyone else, silencing difference. Mill wrote, "The liberty of the individual must be limited by the liberty of others." But he also adds, "The pressure of public opinion can be as oppressive as any political tyranny." In the Victorian society he lived in, Mill already saw it happening. People who thought differently were mocked. Anyone who broke social customs was pushed away. Freedom was celebrated in speeches, but punished in real life. Mill defended the importance of real individuality. For him, human progress depends on living alongside difference. A society where everyone thinks the same isn't free, it's trained and domesticated. That criticism still fits our world today. We live in a time where freedom of speech is defended, but anyone who disagrees with the dominant group can face cancelling, moral attacks, and exclusion. A culture obsessed with appearance and approval pressures people into one acceptable way to behave. And now, the leash doesn't come from the government, it comes from other people's eyes. Worse, many times, the person becomes their own watchdog. They avoid saying what they think, they hide their desires, they pretend to agree, they push down their real self. And that is the opposite of freedom. If Hobbes showed that we trade freedom for safety, and Mill showed that we trade freedom for acceptance, Zhuangzi, a Taoist thinker from ancient China, goes even further. He says, social freedom is always an illusion. Zhuangzi lived in the 4th century BCE during a time of war and instability in China. But instead of proposing a better political system or a new moral code, he invited people to step away from the system entirely. His philosophy is very different from the Western tradition. Zhuangzi isn't looking for better laws or a fairer government. He's looking for total detachment from social pressure. He writes, "The true person has no name, no success, no failure. They simply flow." Zhuangzi compared life to a fish swimming in a river or a bird flying in the sky. They don't follow external rules. They follow their own nature. But human beings, trying to fit into society's standards, get trapped. Language, judgment, moral values, these become invisible chains. For him, being free is living in harmony with the Tao, the natural flow of the universe. That requires letting go of the ego, of opinions, of the hunger for status or control. So freedom isn't something you win on the outside. It's an inner state. Zhuangzi tells strange, funny, almost absurd stories to show how we trap ourselves inside our own ideas. He asks, for example, "I dreamed I was a butterfly, but when I woke up, I didn't know if I was a man who dreamed he was a butterfly, or a butterfly dreaming he is a man." That thought pushes us toward humility. It reminds us that the biggest prison might be believing too much in what society says we are. And to be truly free, you may even have to let go of the idea of freedom itself. Zhuangzi is saying, the more you fight for external freedom, the more you get trapped in expectations. Real freedom is not needing validation from any outside source. Hobbes shows us we accept control out of fear and call it order. Mill reveals that society can control us through opinions, and we call it being civilized. Zhuangzi breaks it all down. The moment freedom is defined from the outside, it becomes a prison. And you? How many of your choices are truly yours? How many times do you obey, stay quiet, or act a certain way just to avoid upsetting others? How many times do you censor yourself out of fear of looking wrong, even when, for you, you know you're right? The modern leash is elegant, comfortable, almost invisible. But it's still a leash. The freedom that truly frees you can't be given by anyone else. It has to be built from within, with detachment, courage, and awareness. How many times has the word civilization been used to hide barbarity? How many times has the flag of progress been planted on someone else's land, watered with blood, domination, and silence? Human history is full of massacres, invasions, and exploitation, often justified in the name of higher values. The colonizer claimed to bring culture. The oppressor claimed to bring order. The violent one called himself a civilizer. But what was really there was power, profit, and control. This brutal contradiction was exposed with force by Frantz Fanon, a psychiatrist, philosopher, and revolutionary from Martinique, who lived firsthand what it means to be colonized. In The Wretched of the Earth, Fanon describes colonialism as a system that disguises itself as a civilizing mission, but in reality destroys cultures, subjugates people, and builds structures of violence. For him, colonialism doesn't only oppress the body, it invades the mind. It creates a feeling of inferiority in the colonized. It makes them want to become like the oppressor and reject their own identity. Fanon writes with anger, but also with clarity. It is the colonizer who creates the colonized. He shows that when European empires invaded Africa, Asia, and Latin America, they claimed they were bringing civilization to savages. But what they brought was economic exploitation, institutional racism, and cultural repression. The language of the civilizing mission was just a way to clean the oppressor's conscience. Colonial education taught dominated people that they were backward, primitive, incapable, and that their only salvation was to adopt the colonizer's values. But for Fanon, that is spiritual murder. The colonized person loses connection to their roots, their history, their dignity. Civilization, in that context, is a thin layer of varnish over barbarity, a polished excuse for systematic violence, a myth used to justify the unjustifiable. And when the oppressed rise up, when they resist, when they fight for freedom, they get labeled violent, irrational, terrorists. Fanon flips that narrative. The violence of the colonized is a response to the violence of the colonizer. He doesn't glorify violence, but he understands that in some contexts, resisting is the only way to recover the humanity that was denied. This forces us to look at the world differently. How many humanitarian interventions hide economic interests? How many wars are fought in the name of democracy, but driven by oil, power, or geopolitical control? How many countries still believe they are saving the world, while crushing cultures and imposing one single way of life? In this same territory, where violence becomes normal, Hannah Arendt enters the conversation. Arendt was a German Jewish philosopher who watched the 20th century break apart into horror. Concentration camps, totalitarian regimes, genocide. In Eichmann in Jerusalem, she followed the trial of Adolf Eichmann, one of the men responsible for the logistics of the Nazi Holocaust, and what she saw disturbed her. Eichmann wasn't a sadistic monster or a psychopath. He was an ordinary, mediocre, obedient bureaucrat. He followed orders, organized trains, signed papers. He helped run the machine that murdered millions without ever truly questioning the morality of it. So Arendt created one of the most chilling expressions in modern philosophy: the banality of evil. Evil, she says, doesn't have to look monstrous. It can be ordinary, everyday, efficient. It can wear a suit, speak politely, sign documents with good manners. It can be done not out of hatred, but out of indifference, blind obedience, and a lack of real thinking. And once again, civilization becomes an accomplice. The Nazi regime saw itself as civilized, modern, advanced. Germany was a center of science, art, and philosophy. And yet, it produced the Holocaust. Evil didn't come from chaos. It came from the system. Arendt warns us that the most dangerous violence is the kind that hides behind legality, order, and bureaucracy, the kind that follows protocols, the kind that says, "I'm just doing my job." It's violence that becomes normal, almost invisible, because it happens inside the rules. We still see versions of this today. Prison systems that target specific groups, public policies that marginalize people while pretending to be neutral, industries that destroy the planet while talking about social responsibility. Once again, civilization becomes the mask covering the machine. But not every story about power has to end in brutality. There's a tradition that points to another path: ethics as the foundation of authority. And one of the most symbolic figures of that idea was Ashoka, an Indian emperor from the 3rd century BCE, known as one of the first rulers to reject violence as a political method. Ashoka began as a conquering king. His empire, the largest in ancient India, was unified through force and brutal battles. But something changed after the War of Kalinga, where thousands died. Faced with the destruction, Ashoka went through a deep moral transformation. After converting to Buddhism, he began to see power not as a tool of domination, but as a spiritual responsibility. His edicts, stone inscriptions spread across his empire, show a philosophy that was surprising for that time. True victory is winning the mind through compassion. Ashoka promoted welfare policies, religious tolerance, protection of animals, public hospitals, and the spread of Dharma, Buddhist moral law. He didn't end authority, but he turned power into service. The Buddhist tradition teaches that power without compassion is barbarity, and that civilization, if it isn't grounded in ethics and awareness, is just polished brutality. So while Fanon exposes civilization being used to justify colonial domination, and Arendt shows that evil can speak the language of order and normal life, Ashoka represents the possibility of power guided by ethical responsibility, not glory. These three perspectives put us in front of a hard choice. Will we keep believing in the civilizing story that masks oppression? Or will we rebuild the meaning of civilization based on real respect for human dignity? It's easy to repeat that we live in a civilized society, but any civilization built on silence, injustice, and forgotten bodies isn't civilization. It's a facade. And have you ever noticed which ideas you repeat without realizing they can justify exclusion? Have you ever questioned how many rules and values you accept that might support systems of domination? Could it be that, without meaning to, you help normalize evil just because it's dressed up as being civilized? Real civilization isn't measured by monuments, technology, or laws. It's measured by compassion, self-awareness, and the courage to break cycles of violence, even the subtle ones. In the name of peace, wars are fought. And in the name of justice, atrocities are committed. History is full of speeches that promote peace as a reason for war. Governments talk about humanitarian missions, necessary interventions, legitimate conflicts. But underneath it all, what's really at stake is power, territory, and economic interests. Language, as always, is the main partner in that manipulation. The talk of peace, most of the time, works like a cover for violence. George Orwell, the author of 1984 and a sharp critic of totalitarian regimes, warned us about this harsh reality. In his essay, Notes on War, Orwell looks at the connection between language and war. He shows how governments, especially during wartime, twist language to make violence feel acceptable, even admirable. Orwell called this kind of mental trick doublethink. The ability to accept two opposite ideas at the same time, like freedom and control, peace and war. He points out how war propaganda uses language to make violence sound noble, something citizens can support without questioning. A classic example is how the word war gets softened into mission or intervention. War, with all its brutality and suffering, gets repackaged as something morally right. Orwell writes, "War is one of the greatest sources of power and control. But when you label it a mission or defense, it becomes acceptable in the public's eyes." In today's world, things like the war on terror and peacekeeping missions are clear examples of that kind of manipulation. The idea of war as a mission creates the illusion that we're fighting for high values, freedom, justice, while in reality, we're feeding a cycle of destruction. By shaping language, war gets turned into something rational, logical, even legitimate. And people accept violence as part of a bigger story, one that always begins with the promise of future peace, but rarely delivers it. While Orwell warns us about language manipulation, the military thinker Karl von Clausewitz, in his classic book On War, gives a more blunt and realistic view of war, without the soft words and peace ideology. Clausewitz, writing during the Napoleonic Wars, is famous for saying, "War is the continuation of politics by other means." That simple line carries a deep point. War is not an isolated event or an accident. It's not something separate from politics. It's politics extended, one way to settle disputes and reach goals when diplomacy fails. Clausewitz understood that war is basically a struggle for power. The motivations behind it aren't purely ideological, they're practical. War is about territory, economics, and strategy. Leaders use war to achieve political goals. He reminds us that decisions about war are made by people seeking strategic advantages, keeping power, expanding borders, controlling resources. In that sense, war is a power game dressed up as morality. Clausewitz's idea reveals an uncomfortable truth. War, at its core, is not mainly about saving lives or protecting human rights. It's mainly about control, and often the public story is built around necessity and defense, while the real motivation is much more complex and tied to strategic interests. Now let's go even deeper into the thinking of Sun Tzu, one of the most respected military strategists of all time, and the author of The Art of War. Even though Sun Tzu wrote more than 2,500 years ago, his lessons still hit hard today, especially when it comes to the relationship between war and peace. Sun Tzu, unlike Clausewitz, doesn't treat war as glorious or inevitable. For him, war should be avoided whenever possible, and the smartest victory is the one achieved without fighting. He writes, "The best victory is the one that requires no battle." This master of strategy emphasizes that war should be a last resort. The greatest success isn't destroying the enemy, it's winning through diplomacy, manipulation, and smart strategy. Sun Tzu believes peace can be a strategy. Instead of fighting head-on, a clever ruler should weaken the enemy indirectly, using their weaknesses, creating pressure, and pushing them to surrender without resistance. That brings us to an interesting paradox. While Clausewitz sees war as a natural extension of politics, Sun Tzu sees war as a final option. For him, peace is often the best strategy to win without opening the doors to direct conflict. Sun Tzu's thinking is almost revolutionary. He suggests that real power isn't defeating your enemy in battle, it's shaping the situation so the enemy feels war is unavoidable and gives up before the fight even happens. In practical terms, you can see this today when major powers use diplomacy, economic sanctions, and political pressure to get what they want without ever needing to invade. Deep down, talk about peace often hides a strategy of control. Coming back to the main point, war is often sold as something necessary for peace. Political speeches, media rhetoric, public statements, they often hide the real goals behind conflicts. War is presented as a mission that will create a better future, but it rarely brings real peace. Orwell, Clausewitz, and Sun Tzu teach us that war is rarely about defense or justice. It's far more about strategy, power, and control. The word peace is often used to justify violence, and behind many war speeches, the real goal is to win without fighting, or worse, to shape public perception until people accept war as inevitable. The lesson is clear. Peace speeches can be some of the most effective weapons for keeping war going. And real peace requires intelligence, courage, and the willingness to break away from manipulative narratives that, instead of bringing calm, keep feeding the cycle of violence. Justice is supposed to be blind, but many times it sees very clearly who's rich, who's poor, who has power, and who is invisible. The promise of justice sounds beautiful. Treat everyone equally under the law, protect the innocent, punish the guilty, guarantee dignity. But in real life, it bends. It becomes selective, biased, hierarchical. It hunts some people with fury while quietly letting others walk away. The uncomfortable truth is that justice doesn't always serve truth. It often serves power. This criticism already shows up in Plato, one of the greatest philosophers of ancient Greece, in the Republic. Plato begins the dialogue with a simple but disturbing question. What is justice? But the first answer doesn't come from him. It comes from Thrasymachus, a sophist, and his reply is sharp and direct. Justice is the advantage of the stronger. That line hits like a punch. For Thrasymachus, what we call just is whatever benefits the people in charge. Kings, rulers, elites, they shape laws to protect their own interests. And anyone who obeys those laws believes they're being just, when in reality, they're helping maintain an order built to favor the powerful. Plato, through Socrates, disagrees. He tries to argue that justice is harmony in the soul, a good in itself, a virtue that should stand above personal interests. But even Plato ends up describing, in his ideal city, a very hierarchical society. Philosophers rule, warriors protect, workers obey. Each class has its place, and justice means everyone doing their role. But here's the problem. Who defines those roles? Who decides where each person belongs? And doesn't that ideal justice also end up protecting the stability of an intellectual elite that sees itself as superior? Even in Plato, justice can still be used to protect order, not real fairness, and that's exactly what happens today. Laws may look neutral, but they aren't. They are created inside social systems that favor certain groups, and even when they're written for everyone, they often work as tools to protect privilege. Anyone who has had to face the justice system knows this. Skin color, your neighborhood, your last name, your access to a good lawyer, these things matter. And the system that should balance the scale often tilts it even more toward the powerful. This becomes even clearer when we talk about punishment, a central theme for Cesare Beccaria, an 18th century legal thinker and philosopher, author of On Crimes and Punishments. Beccaria lived in a Europe marked by brutal punishments, arbitrary prisons, and sentences driven by revenge. Penalties were public, painful, theatrical, but rarely fair. They were more about showing the ruler's power than correcting wrongdoing. He wrote, "Every punishment that is not based on absolute necessity is an abuse of power." That sentence sums up his goal, to turn criminal justice from a horror show into something rational and proportional. For Beccaria, punishment isn't supposed to be revenge. It's supposed to prevent future crimes, correct behavior, and protect society. But that only works if punishment is fair, proportional, and applied equally to everyone. Otherwise, justice becomes theatre, a show where the state displays its power to keep people afraid. And in that show, the most vulnerable become the main targets, while the powerful escape through loopholes. Beccaria was one of the first to argue against torture, the death penalty, and arbitrary judicial power. His book influenced legal codes in many countries. But even today, centuries later, his fight still feels current. Because punishment is still select. Skin color still affects how police approach someone. The neighborhood you live in still influences whether you'll be heard or condemned. And white-collar crimes, no matter how serious, almost never receive the same fury the system directs at poverty crimes. Justice stays harsh with the weak and gentle with the strong. And selective punishment isn't an accident. It reflects a social structure that uses justice to maintain control. This critique appears in a surprising place. The philosophy of Mozi, a Chinese thinker from the 5th century BCE, often forgotten but incredibly relevant. Mozi was one of the first to argue for a universal, impartial view of justice. In his teaching, known as impartial care, Jian Ai, he says everyone should be treated with the same concern, no favoritism, no special privileges. And he applies that principle to the state. Mozi condemns governments that favor allies, benefit the wealthy, and apply laws unevenly. For him, real justice is whatever actually helps the people, not just the elite. He writes, "A wise ruler does not govern for the nobles, but for everyone." This goes against the traditional Confucian mindset of his time, which defended a hierarchical society based on status and ritual. Mozi breaks with that, offering an equal, practical ethic. For him, justice isn't ritual or abstract theory. It's real action that improves life for those who need it most. If it doesn't do that, it's fake. Mozi teaches that justice should be measured by how much it serves the common good, not how nice it sounds. If it doesn't reach the poor, if it protects the privileged, if it reinforces inequality, then it isn't justice. That's a radical idea, because it forces us to ask whether the justice system we have today serves the people or serves the owners of power. And more than that, it forces us to ask whether we've started treating selective justice like it's normal. Plato shows how justice can be used to preserve the order of those who rule. Beccaria exposes punishment as a power performance when there's no proportionality. Mozi demands justice that is impartial and useful to the people, without favoritism. Together, these voices remind us that justice doesn't happen automatically. It has to be watched, questioned, corrected. Because if we let it run without criticism, it slips and turns into a weapon. And you, how many times have you seen injustice justified because it's the law? How many times have you seen innocent people punished while guilty people get protected by prestige, money, or a last name? Selective justice isn't only a problem of the system, it's also a reflection of our culture, our biases, our silence. Real justice is the kind that bends toward fairness, not toward power. And as long as it isn't equal for everyone, it will always be privilege disguised as virtue. In a time when appearance defines value, buying things is no longer just a need or a pleasure. Consumption has become a way to declare who we are, or more honestly, who we want to look like. People get judged by the brands they wear, the causes they support, the restaurants they go to, the shows they watch, the books they display on the shelf, even if they never read them. Consumption has become the new language of identity, and more than that, it has started working like a moral code, being ethical, aware, interesting, admirable. All of that can now be shown through what you consume. This is where Guy Debord comes in, one of the clearest critics of modern culture. In The Society of the Spectacle, 1967, he argues that reality has been replaced by its representation. Debord says, "Everything that was once lived directly has become a representation." For him, the spectacle isn't just media or entertainment. It's a system where human relationships are mediated by images. Life stops being lived and starts being performed. The self exists in other people's display window. And in that world, consumption becomes a constant stage. People buy clothes, ideas, lifestyles, not only for themselves, but to be seen. What matters most isn't the real experience, but what it means in public. Consumption becomes a kind of visual morality. You show solidarity with an activist t-shirt wisdom with a book in your hand, engagement with a hashtag, spirituality with an online meditation course. But all of this can easily become more image than substance. Looking replaces being. Ethics becomes aesthetics. Identity turns into a catalogue of signs, edited to fit a feed. This logic goes even deeper with Jean Baudrillard in The Consumer Society, where he says consumption isn't mainly about meeting needs. It's about producing meaning. In today's world, things don't matter because of what they are, but because of what they symbolize. Baudrillard writes, "We don't consume objects, we consume signs. A car isn't just transportation. It's a symbol of status, freedom, masculinity, or success. Clothing isn't just something you wear. It communicates style, class, and belonging to a tribe or ideal. So consuming becomes a symbolic way of placing yourself in the world. Choosing a brand, a diet, a show, a store becomes a way to say, this is who I am, or who I want to appear to be. But that symbolic identity has a price, the constant need to update yourself. You have to reinvent yourself non-stop to stay relevant, to keep playing the game. Identity becomes unstable, anxious, dependent on new symbols, and consumption becomes an endless source of temporary self-validation. Baudrillard points out that this creates a society where everything becomes a product, even values like ethics, social awareness, spirituality, and a sustainable lifestyle. Today, you can buy the look of being a good person. You can purchase green products, support good causes, wear ethical fashion, even if, behind it all, it's just marketing. Conscience becomes a market aesthetic. Morality becomes personal branding. But there's an ancient voice that cuts through that illusion at the root. Dogen, a 13th century Japanese Zen master and author of the Shobogenzo, one of the deepest texts in the Zen tradition. For Dogen, identity isn't built through possessions, image, or social distinction. It grows through daily practice, mindful attention, quiet ethics, and detachment. The ego that needs validation is the source of suffering. The self that attaches itself to external things, status, titles, objects, will always be off balance. He writes, "To study the way is to study the self. To study the self is to forget the self." That's the radical Zen shift. While modern life builds the self through accumulation, Zen dissolves the self through emptiness. Dogen teaches that attachment is the root of suffering, and that includes attachment to material goods and attachment to social identity. Even the obsession with being someone can become a prison. Even consuming spiritual or ethical ideas can become attachment disguised as virtue. Unlike the logic of spectacle and signs, Zen doesn't care what you seem to be. It cares about how you live right now. What matters isn't the image you project, but the awareness you bring to your breathing, your walking, your care, your service, your silence. Identity, for Dogen, isn't a label. It's a quiet practice. It's a path, not a profile. Debord says we traded reality for performance. Baudrillard shows we consume symbols to look like something, not to be it. Dogen invites us to quit the image game and dissolve the ego in the present moment. The big contradiction of modern society is that the more people try to define themselves through consumption, the more they lose themselves. They chase a moral identity built on objects, opinions, images, but every new purchase, every new self-statement, quickly needs the next one. It's a thirst that never ends. How many people live like storefronts of themselves? How many feel anxious because they don't have the right body, the right outfit, the right words, the right political stance? How many try to buy self-worth, meaning, belonging? And how many confuse their ethics with the image they build? The danger is quiet, because consumption today doesn't look shallow. It wears the mask of awareness, sustainable, inclusive, engaged, healthy, intelligent, ethical. But if it isn't coming from real practice, if it isn't supported by consistency, inner silence, and clarity, then it's just another performance. Being is not the same as looking. Awareness is not an image. Spirituality is not an aesthetic. True identity isn't in what you display. It's in what you grow when nobody is watching. And the real value of a life isn't measured by the symbols you collect, but by the depth you bring to each small act. The way out of this maze isn't more ethical consumption or the most accepted viewpoint. It's letting go of the need for an image. It's having the courage to be invisible. It's the peace of living without needing to prove anything. As Dogen would say, the path isn't about gaining something. It's about forgetting yourself and finding, in that forgetting, a freedom no market can sell. These days, being outraged looks like a sign of virtue. Social media is full of fiery speeches, typed protests, and bold, all-caps slogans. Everyone is against something. Everyone seems to be on the right side. But is all outrage real? Are we angry because we truly want to change something, or because outrage has become a role to play? That's the hard but necessary critique behind performative outrage. When showing that you're against something replaces the effort to actually do something. One of the first people to raise this issue, almost 2,000 years ago, was Seneca, the Roman Stoic philosopher. In his letters to Lucilius, he talks about how important it is for your words and your life to match. For him, real virtue isn't something you show off. It's something you build quietly. Even in his time, Seneca saw people who preached big ideas about morality, justice, politics, but privately lived in ways that contradicted everything they said. He wrote, "It's not the eloquent speaker we should admire, but the just man." For the Stoics, virtue is internal, not decorative. It's not enough to talk about ethics. You have to live ethically. There's no point in getting worked up about the world's evil if you don't have control over your own character, desires, and reactions. Seneca warns that outrage without action turns into moral vanity, the pleasure of looking virtuous without the burden of actually acting. It becomes a theatre of superiority, where someone feels better than others simply because they point out other people's mistakes. Sound familiar? All it takes is one controversial news story and the flood of angry comments begins. But how many of the people shouting about injustice are really willing to work to solve it? How many are willing to face, inside themselves, the same kind of hypocrisy they condemn in others? For Seneca, quiet virtue is worth more than 1,000 theatrical words. Controlled action is nobler than empty noise. And anyone who constantly needs to prove their virtue to the world probably hasn't found it within themselves yet. This gap between what someone looks like and what they really are shows up in a more existential, painful way in Søren Kierkegaard, a 19th century Danish philosopher. In The Sickness Unto Death, he describes what he calls the despair of the self, the pain of being disconnected from who you truly are. For Kierkegaard, a human being is called to become themselves. That's a deep, lonely, difficult process. But many people run from that journey by hiding behind roles, masks, and ideologies. He wrote, "The self is a relation that relates itself to itself." In other words, being yourself means facing your contradictions, your emptiness, your fears. It means stopping the constant distraction of outside causes long enough to look inward. Here's the critical point. Many people cling to angry causes as a way to escape themselves. They burn with rage at the world, but never face their own inner darkness. Kierkegaard isn't saying we shouldn't fight for justice. He's saying that acting outwardly without transforming inwardly can become a form of despair disguised as engagement. How many times does someone take a stand for others, but loses themselves in the process? How often does the fight become an identity, a shield, a way to avoid inner silence? In the name of doing good, we forget self-knowledge. In the name of outrage, we avoid the uncomfortable truth that sometimes we're part of the same system we criticize. In that case, outrage becomes a stage, and the self becomes a desperate actor, performing virtue to avoid the silence of not knowing who they are. That's why Kierkegaard calls it the sickness unto death, the despair of someone who refuses to be who they are, and to escape that, wears 1,000 masks, including masks of goodness, justice, and reason. This same wisdom appears in a direct and poetic way in the teachings of the Buddha, especially in the Dhammapada, one of the most important texts in the Buddhist tradition. the Buddha warns that nice words aren't enough. Talking about virtue, compassion, detachment, none of that matters if the mind isn't being transformed. He says, better than 1,000 empty words is one word that brings peace. In Buddhism, speech is an action with power, but also a risk. Words can free, but they can also deceive, especially when they're used to create an image of wisdom without actually living wisely. Buddhism insists the ego is clever. It hides even inside good intentions. It can turn even fighting for good into a subtle form of vanity, attachment, and pride. The Dhammapada warns, even if someone recites many sacred texts, if they don't practice them, they are like a shepherd counting other people's cattle. In other words, knowledge doesn't matter if you don't live it. It doesn't matter if you call yourself compassionate, if your heart is still full of anger. It doesn't matter if you speak about justice, if your mind is still trapped by comparison, envy, and the hunger for approval. For the Buddha, transforming the mind matters more than impressing the world. You have to develop clarity to see when outrage is truly connected to compassion, and when it's just an emotional disguise for vanity or fear. Seneca teaches that outrage without action is vanity. Kierkegaard shows that the self can hide behind causes to avoid facing itself. The Buddha reminds us that words without practice are just noise. Not all outrage is virtue. It can be escape. It can be pride. It can be a character you play. Real ethics begins in the quiet work of the self, in the effort to align thought, speech, and action. It begins with the humility to admit that pointing out mistakes is easier than changing yourself. And you? How many times have you felt good about being outraged, but did nothing beyond that? How many times have you used the language of doing good to avoid the discomfort of looking inward? How many times was your outrage just a well-made mask? This isn't about staying silent in the face of injustice. It's about speaking truth and living with consistency. Without that, outrage becomes moral noise, a performance for an audience, self-deception dressed up as courage. Real strength isn't shouting louder, it's acting with integrity even when nobody is applauding. As the Buddha said, master yourself like a merchant guides his horse well. As Kierkegaard said, become yourself. This is the deepest task. And as Seneca reminded us, philosophy is not an art of words, but of actions. From an early age, we're taught that work is a virtue. The idea that work gives a person dignity gets repeated like a mantra. If you work hard, you're seen as a good citizen, a role model, a winner. But how far does that idea really hold up? And what happens when dignity turns into exhaustion and effort becomes a quiet way of getting sick? The glorification of work runs deep, culturally, morally, and religiously, and few people unpack that construction more clearly than Max Weber, a German sociologist from the early 1900s. In The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, Weber explored how religious morality helped shape modern capitalism. To understand this, he looked closely at Protestant ethics, especially Calvinism, which taught that work was a way to serve God. Material success, in that view, could be seen as a sign of divine favor, almost like a spiritual stamp that you were among the chosen. Weber writes, "The individual's duty is to work as if success were the only visible sign of grace. The result? A mindset where a person's value started being measured by productivity. Laziness became a sin, leisure became suspicious, and suffering at work became proof of virtue." Weber called this worldly asceticism, a life devoted to work not for pleasure, but as a moral obligation. Over time, that ethic detached from religion, but it stayed alive inside capitalist culture. Today, even without mentioning God, the logic is the same. If you work a lot, you're a fighter, hard-working, worthy. If you rest too much, you're a loser, lazy, guilty. The problem is that this work morality, once religious, has now become a disciplinary machine, and more than that, it has become a psychological prison. That's exactly what Byung-Chul Han, a contemporary South Korean philosopher, talks about in The Burnout Society. Han argues that today's person is no longer exploited mainly by an external boss, but by themselves. He writes, "The disciplinary society has been replaced by a performance society. There's no longer a need for a supervisor cracking the whip. Now, each person becomes their own executioner. You push yourself, compare yourself, demand more from yourself, and you burn out. You internalize the logic of productivity. You become a business of yourself. In Han's view, freedom gets hijacked by the obligation to perform. You can do anything, but really, you must do everything. You must be productive, creative, healthy, engaged, available, constantly, all the time. Work, in this model, invades your free time. Leisure becomes an extension of performance. Social media becomes your resume. Even rest has to be posted, as if even taking a break needs validation. The result? A tired society, anxious, depressed, full of burnout and guilt. But nobody notices because everyone is too busy trying to look okay. Exhaustion becomes a trophy. Saying, "I'm always grinding," becomes a compliment. Suffering becomes a badge of merit. Han warns that this self-exploitation is even more cruel than traditional exploitation, because now you can't blame the boss. You are both the exploiter and the exploited, and guilt eats you from the inside, without a break, without mercy. In that world, the idea that work gives dignity turns into a cycle of self-punishment disguised as virtue. Work stops being a way to make a living and becomes a constant test of your personal worth. And dignity, which should be tied to being human, to respect, to life, gets held hostage by performance. But there's a radical antidote to this obsession with doing, an ancient philosophy that argues for the exact opposite. That's Laozi, a Chinese master from the 6th century BCE, author of the Tao Te Ching, and a founding figure of Taoism. While the world shouts, "Do more," Laozi whispers, "The wise person does not force things, and yet everything gets done." This is the principle of Wu Wei, which literally means effortless action or non-forcing. But it doesn't mean laziness or passivity. It means acting in harmony with life's natural flow, without pushing, without over-controlling, without hurting yourself in the process. For Laozi, the more we move away from the Tao, the natural way things unfold, the more we get trapped in artificial actions, endless desires, and exhausting effort. He writes, "The more rules, the more poverty. The more weapons, the more chaos. The more knowledge, the more deception." That critique hits hard in modern work culture. While capitalism demands more and more, the Tao invites less. While society praises non-stop effort, Taoism values flow, balance, and silence. While the world admires productivity, Laozi admires simplicity. He teaches that acting without obsession isn't laziness, it's wisdom. It's knowing when to stop, where the limit is, and why rest matters. It's recognizing that life doesn't have to be an endless chain of goals. In Laozi's thinking, being matters more than doing, and someone who acts in peace with the present moment often has more real power than someone constantly fighting against the current. This lesson is urgent, because when work culture becomes a moral absolute, it drains life of meaning. Everything starts revolving around goals, results, performance, and human dignity becomes dependent on the ability to produce until you break. But what happens after you break? Who takes care of exhaustion? Who repairs what was lost in the name of productivity? Who gives back the time, the relationships, the mental health? Max Weber showed how this work ethic took root culturally. Byung-Chul Han showed how it moved inside us until it became self-exploitation. Laozi reminds us there's another path, less forcing, more listening, more presence. In the end, the lesson is clear. Work can give dignity, but only up to the point where there's still a whole human being behind it. Past that point, it oppresses, sickens, destroys. Dignity isn't in exhaustion, it's in balance. It's in the ability to say no when your soul needs rest. It's the freedom to work without losing yourself. And you? How many times have you felt guilty for resting? How many times have you thought you'd only be worthy if you were always producing? How many times have you hidden your pain behind the label of tireless worker? Maybe it's time to stop, to breathe, to remember that living is more than producing, and that life, like the Tao, doesn't demand performance, it demands presence. Few topics create as much judgment, repression, and control as sexuality. It's intimate and personal, tied to desire, the body, and our deepest sense of identity. And because of that, throughout history, it has been targeted by strict rules, harsh moralism, and quiet taboos. Society talks about freedom, yet it still regulates, often violently, who is allowed to desire, how they should desire, with whom, and in what way. Behind speeches about decency, family values, and good morals, there's often a logic of domination and exclusion. Sexual morality, in that context, becomes a social weapon. A weapon that doesn't protect, it disciplines. That doesn't liberate, it shames. This critique was explored deeply by Sigmund Freud, the father of psychoanalysis, especially in Civilization and its Discontents. Freud starts with an uncomfortable point. For society to function, the individual has to repress their strongest impulses, especially sexual ones. He writes, "Civilization demands the renunciation of instinct." For Freud, life in society is possible only because people suppress their desires in the name of living together. But that repression has a cost: guilt, neurosis, and hypocrisy. Desire doesn't disappear. It gets pushed into the unconscious, where it turns into anxiety, psychological suffering, and moral contradictions. That's where the discontent of civilization is born. A world where everyone pretends they don't desire, while desire leaks out through the cracks. A society that imposes strict rules about sex, but secretly consumes pornography, sexualizes everything, and publicly punishes what it privately practices. For Freud, sexual repression doesn't make anyone more virtuous. It just makes them more divided. That division creates a kind of neurotic person, guilty for wanting, confused about what they're allowed to feel, and constantly afraid of doing something wrong under the current moral code. And it's in this tension between desire and repression that social hypocrisy thrives. The people who present themselves publicly as pure, traditional family, good citizens often live double lives, full of secrets, inner conflict, and fear of judgment. Freud wasn't defending total sexual freedom with no limits. He was showing that a sexual morality built on repression usually creates more suffering than virtue. This critique becomes even sharper with Judith Butler, a contemporary philosopher who, in Gender Trouble, expands the discussion by showing that gender, like sexual morality, is shaped through performance. Butler argues we are not born with a fixed sexual or gender identity. She writes, "Gender is a performance, something repeated and regulated, making us recognizable within a system of norms. In other words, it's not enough to be biologically male or female. You're expected to act like a man or a woman according to cultural standards. And anyone who steps outside that performance, through behavior, desire, expression, or identity, gets punished. That punishment doesn't only come from formal institutions. It also comes from stares, ridicule, mockery, isolation. Society creates sexual and gender norms to organize bodies and behavior and excludes those who fail to perform correctly. So sexual morality isn't just a matter of personal opinion. It works like a tool of social control. It defines what counts as normal, desirable, respectable, and what is wrong, shameful, or deviant. That structure is violent because it normalizes inequality. It justifies discrimination, prejudice, and marginalization by saying someone doesn't fit. And it also blocks people from living their desire with freedom and dignity. For Butler, the challenge is to dismantle these norms, to show there isn't one right way to desire, love, or express yourself, and that any morality built on excluding others is less about ethics and more about power. Against this background of repression and judgment, some traditions have approached sexuality in a much more integrated and less hypocritical way. One example is the classical Indian tradition that produced the Kama Sutra, which is often misunderstood in the West. Written by Vatsyayana between the 3rd and 5th centuries, the Kama Sutra is not a porn manual, like pop culture often makes it seem. It's a philosophical text about desire, pleasure, and relationships, within a wider view of spirituality and ethics. In this Indian tradition, desire, karma, is seen as one of the 4 legitimate goals of human life, alongside duty, dharma, prosperity, artha, and liberation, moksha. So pleasure isn't a moral failure, it's part of a full life. The Kama Sutra treats pleasure with respect, awareness, and beauty. It recognizes sexuality as part of human nature and says that when lived with sensitivity and ethics, it can deepen life itself. It doesn't demand repression, it offers understanding, treating desire as something worthy of care, not shame. And here's the key point. Hypocrisy isn't born from desire, it's born from taboo. When society represses pleasure, it doesn't erase it, it pushes it into the shadows. Desire becomes a secret, the secret becomes guilt, and guilt turns into judgment of others. Then the people who don't fit the norm get treated like a moral threat, even when they're simply expressing real human diversity. With its respectful approach, the Kama Sutra shows that pleasure and ethics can coexist, along with freedom and awareness. That stands in sharp contrast to modern sexual morality, which is often obsessed with banning things, but incapable of guiding people. It talks about purity, but not about respect. It talks about tradition, but not about consent. It talks about honor, but often ignores freedom. Freud shows how repression creates guilt and hypocrisy. Butler reveals that gender and sexual norms are performances that exclude those who don't fit. And the Kama Sutra offers a tradition where desire can coexist with ethics, freedom, and awareness. When sexual morality is used as a weapon, it doesn't protect, it harms. It harms people who desire differently. It harms people who love outside the script. It harms people who stay silent just to survive the symbolic and real violence of a society still hiding behind unresolved taboos. And you? How many times have you seen someone judged? Not for harming anyone, but simply for loving differently. How many times has morality been used more to punish than to guide with compassion? How many times has desire been treated like sin, when it was really just a sign of life? Sexual freedom isn't recklessness, it's maturity, it's responsibility toward your own desire, and respect for someone else's desire. And a society will only be truly ethical when it stops using sexual morality as control, and starts using love as its compass. Faith is born in the quiet of the soul. It's intimate, subtle, personal. But throughout history, what began as a spiritual search often turned into a system, structures, hierarchies, and control. Religion, which should have set people free, has often been used to control. And what should have brought people together has sometimes divided them, judged them, and dominated them. The tension between sincere faith and institutional power is one of the oldest and deepest conflicts in human history. On one side, there's the human longing for transcendence, meaning, and connection with the sacred. On the other, there are religious institutions with their doctrines, leaders, rules, censorship, and dogmas. The painful question is, when did faith stop being a path and become a leash? This dilemma appears powerfully in Fyodor Dostoevsky's novel, The Brothers Karamazov, especially in the famous chapter, The Grand Inquisitor. In it, one character imagines that Jesus returns to Earth during the Spanish Inquisition and is immediately arrested by the church itself. In that disturbing monologue, the Inquisitor confronts Jesus and says, "You brought us freedom. But people don't want to be free. They want security, bread, and order. So we, the church, corrected what you started." Dostoevsky's criticism is brutal. He shows how a religious institution can betray the spirit of faith in the name of authority. Christ, who preached love, forgiveness, and inner freedom, is rejected by the very organization that claims to represent him. Deep down, What the Inquisitor reveals is that power fears the inner freedom that real faith gives, because a person who finds God within themselves no longer needs a mediator, a rigid dogma, or external control. For Dostoevsky, that is the danger. Religion can become a way to dominate consciences, and the more it becomes institutional, the more it tends to drift away from compassion and move closer to punishment, blind obedience, and fear. This isn't about attacking religion itself. It's about recognizing that genuine faith is something you live, not something you submit to. And when faith gets captured by power structures, it can turn into a tool of repression. This critique also appears, using a different language, in the work of Baruch Spinoza, a 17th century philosopher, in the Theological Political Treatise. Spinoza lived in a Europe where religion still shaped laws, customs, universities, and especially politics. He was Jewish by background, but he was excommunicated by his own community for ideas they considered heretical. And it was through that experience of exclusion that he understood the danger of religion being used as a tool of power. Spinoza writes, "The purpose of religion is not obedience to laws, but love of one's neighbor and the practice of justice." But he argues that historically, religions often allied with the state to keep people under control. It's not enough to command people. You have to convince them that obedience is God's will. So political laws start getting treated like sacred laws. Disobedience stops being just a crime. It becomes a sin. Criticism of authority gets labeled as blasphemy. Spinoza argues that true religion sets people free, but institutional religion tends to create servitude. It creates fear instead of love, dogma instead of thought, authority instead of dialogue. That's why he defends a strong separation between faith and political power, so spirituality can return to being a personal path of ethics and reason, not a machine used by the state to control society. And here comes a third perspective, even deeper, more subtle and disarming. Nagarjuna, one of the greatest thinkers in Mahayana Buddhism, author of the Mulamadhyamaka Karika, written around the 2nd century CE. Nagarjuna isn't mainly talking about religion versus politics. He's talking about something more invisible, attachment to dogma as a source of illusion and hypocrisy. His philosophy centers on shunyata, or emptiness. Things have no fixed, permanent essence. There are no eternal ideas, no absolute truths. And it's exactly when we cling to fixed ideas, including religious ones, that we create suffering. He writes, "To cling to a view is to not understand the Dharma." For Nagarjuna, even attacking religion can become a new kind of attachment. Someone who attacks dogmas with anger often does it because they want a different dogma to replace it. The mind wants to be right. It wants control. It wants to feel morally superior. But the true spiritual path, according to him, requires letting go, even of your own beliefs, not as nihilism, but as a radical openness to reality. It's a difficult lesson, because it invites us to see that religious hypocrisy isn't only in leaders, it's also in our attachment to certainty, in the urge to be right, in the spiritual vanity of knowing the truth, in the hidden desire for superiority disguised as faith. Nagarjuna's wisdom suggests that religion is only authentic when it helps us loosen our grip, not tighten it, when it helps us look with compassion, not judgment, when it leads us to silence, not empty rhetoric. Dostoevsky warns that when faith becomes institutional, it can become a prison for human consciences. Spinoza shows that when religion is used politically, it reinforces fear and servitude. Nagarjuna teaches that even the attack on dogma can be another form of attachment, and that spirituality begins with inner detachment. The conclusion is simple but deep. Sincere faith is a practice that transforms you. Institutional power is often a structure that shapes behavior without touching the heart. And you? Have you ever asked yourself whether your faith comes from within, or from the need to belong to a group? Have you reflected on whether what you believe is lived with compassion, or with judgment? Have you noticed whether the religion you follow brings you closer to love, or mostly reinforces fear, guilt, and rigidity? Authentic spirituality doesn't need applause or a big structure. It happens in silence, in care, in the clarity to recognize that no system, no matter how beautiful it looks, should replace the inner work of humility, self-knowledge, and transformation. Faith is not control. Faith is not blind obedience. Faith, when it's real, is deep freedom. People say human beings are rational animals, but if you look around and look inside yourself, you realize how fragile that rationality really is. In the name of safety, we obey. In the name of convenience, we stay quiet. In the name of the majority, we repeat. We can create complex theories, brilliant science, revolutionary ideas. But in everyday life, how often do we just go with the flow? How many decisions get made out of habit, fear, social pressure, or simple laziness? The laziness of not wanting to think. Philosophy has warned for centuries about this gap between the reason we admire and the obedience we practice, and few people expressed it more clearly than Immanuel Kant in his 1784 essay, What is Enlightenment? Kant defines enlightenment as man's emergence from his self-imposed immaturity. For Kant, immaturity is the inability to use your own reason without someone else guiding you. But he doesn't blame ignorance. He blames laziness and cowardice. It's easier to let others think for us, the priest, the government, the expert, the influencer. It's more comfortable to obey than to take responsibility. He writes, I have a book that understands for me, a doctor who decides my diet for me, a pastor who has a conscience for me, so I don't need to think. The problem isn't only obedience, it's the comfort of giving up your autonomy. For Kant, reason is a call to courage, the courage to question, to make mistakes, to rethink. The motto of enlightenment is direct, sapere aude, dare to know. But that daring takes effort, and most people prefer the peace of obedience to the pain of freedom. So even in societies that call themselves free, what we often see are domesticated minds, unable to resist the power of the group, tradition, or authority. That passivity towards social forces was studied deeply by Gustave Le Bon in The Crowd, a study of the popular mind published in 1895. Le Bon was one of the first thinkers to analyze how human behavior changes when an individual becomes part of a mass. According to him, when people are inside a crowd, physical or digital, they drop critical thinking and shift into emotional reactions. Reason gives way to contagion. Individual responsibility dissolves into the collective. Le Bon writes, a crowd does not reason, it feels and acts on impulse. For him, crowds respond to symbols, slogans, and powerful images, not to logical arguments. That helps explain why simple, emotional, authoritarian messages gain so much strength during moments of crisis. Inside a crowd, your individual identity fades. Collective fear, excitement, or anger replaces reflection. A person who might be sensible alone can become irrational when swept up in group energy. Today, social media amplifies this in a way that's almost invisible. Likes, shares, echo chambers, cancel waves. This is Le Bon's crowd logic, but digital. We're increasingly moved by emotional contagion, even while we believe we're being rational, and we feel comfort in following the group, because it gives us belonging, safety, identity. But deep down, it's often just fear of thinking differently, fear of being alone. Le Bon warns that this vulnerability in human reason is perfect ground for charismatic, authoritarian leaders. People who know how to use emotional language, manipulate fears and desires, and promise order in exchange for obedience. So, the Enlightenment ideal of independent reason bends to the pull of the leader, the group, the ideology. The rational freedom won through effort gets handed over willingly for psychological comfort. But there's a possible path between Kant's philosophical reason and Le Bon's emotional chaos. A quieter, more practical, more existential path. You can find it in the work of Miyamoto Musashi, a 17th century Japanese samurai and strategist author of the Book of Five Rings. Musashi wasn't a philosopher in the Western sense, but his wisdom runs deep. He wrote about war, discipline, strategy, but above all, self-mastery. He understood that the biggest enemy isn't outside you, it's the distracted mind, the deluded ego, the fear pretending to be logic. Musashi writes, "There is nothing outside of yourself that can ever enable you to get better, stronger, richer, quicker, or smarter. Everything is within." In the Book of Five Rings, he teaches that mental discipline is the key to winning, not just in combat, but in life. That discipline requires observation, presence, and clarity, not being dragged around by sudden emotions or by the crowd's excitement. Musashi knew that acting without thinking gets you killed faster, and thinking without discipline makes you easy to manipulate by your own illusions. His philosophy reminds us that reason isn't only theoretical, it's practical. It has to be trained like a muscle. Because the ego disguises itself. It dresses up as certainty, pride, intellectual vanity. And when ego is in charge, reason fails, even when it looks right. For Musashi, real rationality isn't about always being right. It's about being present enough to see what's happening, inside you and around you. It's not acting on impulse. It's gaining clarity before reacting. It's training the mind so it won't be a slave to emotions or other people's opinions. Kant invites us to use reason with courage. Le Bon warns us how easily we lose that reason inside the emotional crowd. Musashi shows that inner discipline is the bridge between reason and clear action. So reason is not automatic, not guaranteed, not something we simply have by nature. It's an achievement, a daily practice, a constant watch against the ease of obeying, repeating, following. And you? How many times have you repeated an idea without reflecting? How many times have you been carried by other people's opinions even when you felt something was off? How many times did you trade quiet reflection for the rush of being right? Yes, we are rational, but only when we choose to be. Only when we overcome mental laziness, fear of criticism, and the ego's obsession with being right. Real reason isn't intellectual arrogance. It's active humility. It's the courage to think deeply, to doubt even your own certainties, and to resist being captured by slogans, gurus, or crowds. Clarity today is an act of resistance, and thinking for yourself may be the rarest and bravest kind of freedom. It's easy to point out other people's mistakes. It's hard to admit our own. It's simple to demand ethics, justice, and discipline, as long as it costs us nothing. We live in an age that claims to be morally aware, but it often falls into a quiet trap, using rules as weapons against others and as excuses for ourselves. It's the classic, do what I say, not what I do, and philosophy has recognized this dangerous habit for a long time. We treat our own desires like their principles, and we condemn in others what we quietly tolerate in ourselves. One of the first thinkers to confront this inconsistency was David Hume, an 18th century Scottish philosopher and a major voice in moral philosophy. In a treatise of human nature, Hume exposes an illusion we've carried for centuries: the idea that reason is in charge of our moral choices. For Hume, it's feeling, not reason, that drives our decisions. He writes, "Reason is, and ought only to be, the slave of the passions." In other words, we don't use reason to discover what's right. We use reason to justify what we already want. We want something, and then we build arguments to make it sound fair, ethical, and unavoidable. That leads to an uncomfortable truth. We often tolerate in ourselves the very things we condemn in others, because we know our reasons, our context, our fears. A simple example: we criticize corrupt politicians, but we bend small rules to avoid a fine or get around a system. We condemn intolerance, but we treat people with hostility when they disagree with us. We want justice, but we think it's normal to accept special treatment when it benefits our side. For Hume, this kind of selectiveness isn't the exception. It's the hidden rule of human behavior. And the only way to face it is with a serious level of inner honesty. But it gets even worse when the justification stops being personal and becomes collective, ideological. That's where Albert Camus comes in, especially in The Rebel, written after World War II, when ideals like freedom and justice had been stained by tyrannies that began as revolutions. Well, Camus starts with a disturbing question. Why do revolutions that begin in the search for justice end up creating new systems of oppression? His answer is harsh. Because when an idea becomes absolute, it can justify anything. People kill in the name of freedom. They censor in the name of truth. They oppress in the name of justice. A legitimate rebellion against oppression can become a new tyranny when it loses its sense of limits. What was resistance turns into domination. Camus writes, "Whoever kills for an idea forgets that a human being matters more than any idea." The same logic that applies to individuals, excusing our faults with good reasons, can apply to entire movements. Groups that call themselves ethical, revolutionary, or morally superior often start believing they're above the rules. They act like the goal justifies everything, as if their own wrongdoing should always be forgiven, because the cause is righteous. True. But Camus demands a tragic kind of clarity. Justice without limits becomes violence. Ideology without compassion becomes an exclusion machine. Revolt without self-criticism turns into the same authoritarianism it swore to fight. Camus isn't saying we should be passive or indifferent. He's saying ethical consistency takes constant vigilance, especially against ourselves. Because the most dangerous hypocrisy isn't other people's. It's the hypocrisy living inside our own good intentions. That same call to responsibility shows up in a spiritual and philosophical way in the Bhagavad Gita, one of the most sacred texts in the Indian tradition, part of the epic Mahabharata. In the dialogue between Krishna, the divine guide, and Arjuna, the warrior, we find a deep moral struggle. Arjuna stands on the battlefield, about to face his own relatives. He hesitates. He says he can't fight his own people, that it would be cruel, heartless, destructive. But Krishna responds, "Do your dharma, Arjuna. Do your duty without attachment to the results." The word dharma is essential here. It means something like the right path, ethical duty, the order of life. But dharma is not an excuse to do whatever you want. It's the opposite. It's a call to responsibility beyond the ego. Krishna warns that duty can't be guided by fear, vanity, or convenience. You have to act with clarity, compassion, and firmness at the same time. And above all, don't use duty as a cover for selfish desire. How often do we hide personal interests behind the language of duty? I'm doing this because it's necessary. It's for the greater good. I had no choice. But did we really? The Gita reminds us that dharma feels light when it comes from the heart, and heavy when it's being manipulated by the ego. Someone who truly acts ethically doesn't need to explain themselves non-stop. They don't need a performance or an excuse. Consistency speaks for itself. This ancient wisdom calls for a quiet revolution, acting without hiding behind principles that only apply to other people. Hume shows us how reason can be used to justify desires we already chose. Camus reveals how rebellions without ethics turn into new tyrannies. The Bhagavad Gita teaches that real duty requires humility, not spiritual pride. The lesson is uncomfortable, but necessary. All of us are tempted to use rules like walls for others and windows for ourselves. We create personal exceptions, justify our detours, and place ourselves above judgment. But the world only becomes more just when ethics stops being a speech and becomes an inner practice. When the same standard we use on others is applied to us. When we stop hiding the ego behind principle. And you? How many times have you demanded from others what you don't practice yourself? How many times have you defended a rule until it got in your way? How many times have you convinced yourself, in this case, I was right, when maybe you were just protecting yourself? Moral consistency is rare. And harder than talking about justice is living with justice, even when nobody's watching, even when it hurts, even when it's easier to invent exceptions. As Krishna teaches Arjuna, act with pure intention, without attachment, without pride. That is freedom. We're surrounded by information, news, analysis, headlines, experts, trends. But is all of it true? Or is it just control, packaged in a smarter way? In the age of mass communication, truth can be less of a search and more of a strategic construction. What we call reality might be nothing more than a well-produced script, repeated on every screen, every day, until it feels normal. Truth stops being discovered. It starts being sold. And that's where the distortion begins. One of the thinkers who exposed this manipulation most deeply was Noam Chomsky, an American linguist and political philosopher. In Manufacturing Consent, 1988, written with Edward S. Herman, Chomsky argues that the media doesn't just inform, it manufactures what people are supposed to think. The idea is straightforward. Mass media often serves the interests of economic and political elites, shaping public consent in ways that help keep existing power structures in place. This isn't a conspiracy in the classic sense. There isn't a secret button controlling everything. The control is subtler, and that's exactly why it works. Chomsky calls it the propaganda model. He explains that big media corporations have close ties to governments, banks, the arms industry, and other centers of power. So the news gets filtered. Some topics are highlighted, others are ignored. Certain narratives get repeated until they feel obviously true. He writes, "The function of the media is not to inform, but to instill values and beliefs that integrate people into the system." How many times have you felt like every major outlet is saying the same thing, just with different wording? That some events get selective outrage, while others are quietly buried? That certain countries are framed as villains, while others are called defenders of freedom, depending on who benefits? Chomsky's point is clear. Truth is often just a convenient version of reality. A version shaped to protect those in charge, secure profit, and keep things the way they are. But this problem isn't exclusive to modern media. Philosophers in the ancient world already understood it, especially Plato, in the famous allegory of the cave, in the Republic. In the allegory, Plato describes prisoners chained since birth inside a dark cave. They can only see shadows projected on a wall, shadows of objects passing behind them, lit by a fire. The prisoners believe those shadows are reality. It's all they've ever known, until one of them breaks free, leaves the cave, and sees the real world for the first time. The sun, trees, color, light, the truth. When he returns to tell the others, they don't believe him. They'd rather stick with familiar, comfortable shadows. Plato writes, "They will laugh at the freed man and say his trip blinded him, and if someone tried to free them, they might even kill him." The cave is a powerful metaphor. It shows that ignorance isn't just lack of knowledge, it's attachment to illusion. It's the fear of leaving your comfort zone, even when that comfort zone is made of lies. The modern cave can be the media, as Chomsky suggests, but it can also be culture, ideology, education, dogmatic religion, or the digital bubble we live inside. We're surrounded by well-produced shadows, carefully selected images, manipulative speeches, data without context. All of it creates the feeling of knowledge, while we remain chained to versions of reality that serve hidden interests. And the most dangerous part, the more we believe we already know, the less willing we are to question. That's the most sophisticated prison of the mind. But what if the very idea of truth is more complicated than we think? What if the problem isn't only the media, the government, or other people, but also something inside us? That's where Shinran comes in, a 13th century Japanese monk and one of the major figures in Pure Land Buddhism. In his tradition, spiritual liberation doesn't come from pride or earning it, but from radical humility in the face of our own ignorance. Shinran taught that the biggest obstacle to awakening is being attached to our own certainty. Even when we're wrong, We want to look right. Even when we doubt, we'd rather pretend we're sure. The ego clings to knowing as a form of protection. He writes, "True faith is born not from the strength of the mind, but from the sincere recognition that we do not know." That's a sharp contrast to modern arrogance. We live in a time when everyone has an opinion about everything, delivered with total confidence. Shinran reminds us that the human mind is limited, flawed, confused, and that's why it needs humility. In Pure Land Buddhism, the first step toward enlightenment is admitting we're trapped in illusion, including the illusion that we've already woken up. It's realizing that a lot of what we call my opinion is often just unconscious repetition of voices we learn to trust. That humility isn't weakness. It's quiet strength, because it frees us from the burden of defending our ideas at any cost. It opens us to dialogue, learning, and silence. Chomsky shows how truth can be manufactured from the outside, through media and power. Plato shows we can become prisoners of shadows, and that leaving the cave takes courage. Shinran teaches that real freedom starts when we drop inner arrogance. The lesson is deep. Truth isn't something you own. It's a path built on criticism, questioning, humility, and silence. And you? How many times have you believed something just because everyone was repeating it? How many times have you defended an idea without ever checking where it came from? How many times have you confused confidence with wisdom? Searching for truth is uncomfortable because it forces you to unlearn, to dismantle, to admit you might be wrong, even when you feel too sure. But that discomfort is what cleans the mind and frees the way you see the world. Because the truth that sets you free isn't the one that shouts the loudest. It's the one that survives the test of silence, doubt, and compassion. How many times have we heard promises of equality, equal rights, equal opportunity, equal human dignity? They're written into constitutions, used in advertising campaigns, repeated in political speeches. But when we move from paper to real life, one question screams out, equality. For who? There's a huge gap between what gets said and what actually happens. And that gap is held up by invisible structures, quiet privilege, and traditions that pretend to be fair while still reinforcing exclusion. When philosophy refuses to stay silent in the face of injustice, it becomes a tool that exposes what's hidden. One of the first people to raise this flag with real force was Mary Wollstonecraft, an English thinker from the 18th century and a pioneer of modern feminism. In her most famous work, A Vindication of the Rights of Woman, 1792, she breaks down the contradictions of Enlightenment morality. The male philosophers of her time preached liberty, equality, and brotherhood, but somehow forgot that half the population was excluded from those ideals. Wollstonecraft calls out that hypocrisy directly. She writes, "They talk about reason and freedom as universal rights, but refuse to apply them to women." According to her, public morality preached virtue and rationality, but treated women as social decorations, trained to please men, educated for obedience, taught to depend. She wasn't asking for favors. She was demanding consistency. If Enlightenment thinkers truly believed reason was the foundation of human dignity, they couldn't deny women the same right. What Wollstonecraft exposes is fake universalism, the idea that you speak for everyone, while you think and decide based on the experience of only a few. In practice, equality was a male, white, middle-class concept. Everyone else? An invisible footnote. What Wollstonecraft began in the 18th century becomes even sharper through the powerful critique of Angela Davis, activist, philosopher, and author of Women, Race and Class, 1981. Davis calls out what you could call selective feminism, the kind that claims to speak for all women while ignoring the realities of black women, poor women, and marginalized women. She writes, "Equality without economic and racial justice is just an empty slogan." Angela Davis shows that the fights for civil rights, gender equality, and class justice have to move together. or they risk repeating the oppression they claim to oppose. For example, she points to how black women in the United States were often oppressed in two ways: exploited as cheap labor and dismissed as women who didn't fit the standards of white femininity. While many white suffragists fought for the right to vote, they often stayed quiet about structural racism, or even strengthened it. For Davis, equality can't be reduced to formal access to rights, because rights, when they aren't backed by real conditions, become dead paper. You can have a right to education and still be stuck in failing schools. You can have a right to vote and live in a community that is systematically shut out of political decisions. You can have freedom of speech and still know your voice won't carry the same weight. Davis warns us, equality that ignores social, historical, and structural differences is an equality that keeps inequality alive. And here's where the poetic, critical wisdom of Rabindranath Tagore comes in. Philosopher, educator, and the first Asian person to win the Nobel Prize in Literature, 1913. In his philosophical and political essays, Tagore insists that freedom isn't only legal, it's also cultural, spiritual, and material. In other words, it's not enough to say everyone is equal under the law, if in daily life most people are still being crushed. He writes, "Real freedom requires dignity, and dignity is born when a human being has the means to grow, not just survive." Tagore lived during India's anti-colonial struggle. He watched how Europe's civilizing mission language was used to justify economic exploitation, cultural destruction, and the forced spread of foreign values. And he also saw that Indian nationalism, if it wasn't guided by compassion and education, could become oppressive too. That's why he defended a freedom built not just on laws and borders, but on universal human dignity, a freedom that respects diverse cultures, values truly liberating education, and creates real conditions for people to flourish. Tagore believed that without cultural and material dignity, every kind of equality is just a facade. People don't only need rights, they need real ground to stand on. When you put these three voices together, Wollstonecraft, Angela Davis, and Tagore, you can clearly see the fake shine of equality that exists only in speeches. Wollstonecraft exposes the hypocrisy of Enlightenment ideals that excluded women from reason and citizenship. Angela Davis exposes the illusion of equality that refuses to confront racism and structural inequality. Tagore shows that true freedom has to be lived in culture, education, and everyday dignity. The conclusion hits hard. Equality without changing the structures is just rhetoric. It's makeup on a system that stays the same. It's applause for beautiful campaigns, while poor communities remain forgotten, voices remain silenced, and life stays unequal for the same people as always. How many times have you believed things are getting better just because the language got more inclusive? How many times have you seen equality proclaimed but not felt? How many times have you noticed that the people speaking for everyone still ignore the bodies that were never heard? Real equality doesn't come from catchy phrases. It demands real listening. It demands repair. It demands the courage to confront the structures that protect privilege. It's not just changing the law. It's changing the culture. It's changing access. It's changing who gets heard. It's changing how power and care are distributed. Be a good citizen. Do your duties. Pay your taxes. Follow the laws. Don't cause trouble. The formula sounds clear, almost morally admirable. But what if this good citizen ideal isn't as neutral as it looks? What if it's designed to shape behavior more than it's meant to free anyone's conscience? That's the uncomfortable question we have to ask. Because behind the calm image of civility and order, there can be a deeper system of social control, where the ideal citizen isn't the one who thinks, but the one who obeys without resisting. One of the thinkers who explored this most deeply was Michel Foucault, especially in his work on biopolitics, a term he used to describe how modern power doesn't just punish or repress, but organizes life itself, habits, bodies, behavior, and even desire. Foucault noticed that in modern societies, control often doesn't happen through brute force. It happens through normalization. What does that mean? It means power creates standards for what normal looks like, and along with that, it creates the image of the good citizen. Someone who works, consumes, votes, behaves, doesn't complain, stays in line, and feels like everything is under control. But who gets to decide what good means? Who defines proper behavior? And who benefits from that model? Foucault puts it bluntly: modern power works more through shaping people than through punishing them. It molds the individual even before it needs to punish. That's the key point. The good citizen isn't born ready-made. He's built by schools, media, institutions, and official narratives. It's not just that people are watched. It's that they start watching themselves. The control becomes part of their identity. The person polices their own thoughts and behavior. So biopolitics doesn't only want you to follow the law. It wants you to feel proud for obeying and ashamed for questioning. It wants you to see rebellion as danger, criticism as ingratitude, and being different as a personal failure. The result is a new kind of morality, one that cares more about looking correct than actually being just. That's where Thomas Paine offers a powerful counterpoint. Paine was one of the strongest voices of the American Revolution and a fierce defender of human rights, freedom against tyranny, and active political participation. But he never treated citizenship as something passive or decorative. For Paine, a real citizen is someone who questions, criticizes, challenges power, and demands accountability from leaders. In Common Sense, he writes, "A people trained in blind obedience is a people that has lost its freedom, even if it still votes." Paine believes citizenship without awareness is just democracy as a performance. Voting isn't enough. Obeying isn't enough. And following the law, if the law is unjust, is just submission disguised as civic virtue. This is where his view clashes with the modern good citizen ideal, because that ideal has been shaped to reward docile behavior, not critical thinking. Paine saw citizenship as an active practice of resisting abuse. He criticized crowns, parliaments, and systems that claim to speak for the people while governing for power. His challenge forces a question: how often do we confuse being a citizen with simply following rules? How often do we stay silent in the face of injustice just to keep the peace? How often does the fear of looking too radical make us accept what should never be accepted? But not all criticism has to be loud or aggressive. Sometimes real citizenship starts quietly, inside your own behavior, in the way you build character. That's where Confucius comes in, the Chinese master of ethics and social harmony. In the Analects, a collection of teachings attributed to Confucius, we find a philosophy that values inner integrity as the foundation of public life. Confucius saw society like a living body. Each part affects the whole. But for him, real order doesn't come from external pressure. It comes from the integrity of individuals. He writes, "To govern is to set an example. If you are upright, others will follow without being ordered. If you are not, even if you give orders, no one will truly follow." In other words, a good citizen isn't someone who simply acts the way they're expected to. It's someone who quietly builds an ethic based on sincerity, respect, and responsibility toward others. Confucius didn't separate private ethics from public ethics. For him, a corrupt ruler reflects a culture without virtue. A passive, indifferent people reflects leaders who abandon truth. His central message is that social justice starts with taking care of your own character, but character as real practice, not as a mask. That feels far from today's world, where citizenship often becomes performance, looking involved, posting outrage online, following social rituals perfectly, without deep reflection. Foucault shows how the good citizen is often manufactured by power to guarantee conformity. Paine reminds us that citizenship without questioning becomes submission, and that freedom requires the courage to resist. Confucius teaches that true uprightness starts with character, not blind obedience to social norms. The lesson is simple. It's not enough to look correct. You have to be honest and whole. It's not enough to follow the law. You have to ask whether the law is just. It's not enough to be a citizen. You have to act like one, with awareness, courage, and compassion. And you? How many times have you behaved like a good citizen just to be accepted? How many times have you avoided questioning a rule because you didn't want to upset anyone? How many times have you hidden behind civility to avoid taking a stand for justice? The good citizen ideal can be a trap. It teaches us to value the appearance of order, while injustice hides behind normality. It trains us to obey instead of understand, to stay quiet instead of act. Real citizenship begins when we choose moral clarity, when we understand that being a citizen isn't only about duties, but about responsibility to others, to truth, and to the common good. And that responsibility, as Confucius said, starts inside each of us. Thank you so much for making it to the end. If this content made you think, challenged you, or helped you see the world in a new way, then this journey was already worth it. Now I want to invite you to keep reflecting with us. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next episodes. Hit like, because that really helps this video reach more people who are also looking for critical thinking. Drop a comment below. What stood out to you the most? Where did you see yourself in all of this? Your perspective is a key part of this conversation. Share this video with someone you know needs to hear it. And stay here with us. There's a lot more coming, and you won't want to miss it. See you in the next video.